We are now getting ready to move into Chapter 1, which is an overview of community practice. The book starts out with saying that social work is community practice, and I believe that. It's actually the heart and soul of what we do. There are several different definitions of community practice. Basically, we're looking at it being the application of practice skills. So the same things that you normally do with individuals and families, only in community practice, we're working to change community groups, organizations, institutions, or people's interactions with all of these different entities. It's also called macropractice. It's also called community organization. There's one framework that basically says that macropractice can be conceptualized into community organization or community development, social planning, and social action. Community organization development is basically helping neighborhoods or communities resolve problems and increase the quality of life. Social planning usually uses the expertise of a professional coupled with community members in order to address problems. And then social action is more of what we think about activists doing. It's strategies to develop or redistribute social power. Some of the objectives of community practice include things like developing organizing skills and the abilities of individuals. So it goes along with our emphasis on empowerment, to make social planning more accessible and inclusive in a community. Oftentimes what we know is that decisions in community are made by a small handful of folks and are not necessarily inclusive of people that don't necessarily have a lot of power or influence. It's also to connect social and economic involvement to grassroots community groups. We're going to talk more this semester about grassroots community groups and what those mean. To advocate for broad coalitions in solving community problems. So once again, broadening our strategy so it's not just a few stakeholders, but it's a much broader representation of all individuals in society, including those that are disenfranchised. And then the last objective is to infuse social planning to include social justice. So in community practice, we have this emphasis on social justice. Well and Gambles, they identified 8 practice domains. So look in your book to see what kinds of things they came up with as far as, again, this is another way to conceptualize all the different kinds of areas that social workers involved with community practice are involved in. All right, I'm asking the question, which comes first, the chicken or the egg? In terms of whether we provide direct practice and clinical solutions, or if we look to provide broad community-based solutions, the two are really two sides of the same coin. You have to help individuals in order to make use of community resources, but we have to also recognize that we need efforts to develop community resources and engage individuals as a part of dealing with community problems. We won't solve or fix any larger community problems by simply giving it to elected officials to do. We have to involve the people that are directly impacted and affected by it. One of the things I like about your book is it says communities are always the context, if not always the content, of social work practice. So you can't take the community out of social work. It is what we do. All individuals live in some kind of community. And so that is always going to be our context. So whether you're providing clinical counseling services in a private practice setting, the individuals you're going to be counseling with live in the context of their community, which has an effect on them and their functioning. All right, we're going to talk next week about community theories. These help explain what communities are and how they function. They tend to be complex and hard to define, kind of like communities and organizations. If you've had your practice with individuals, Social Work 505, or your practice with families, Social Work 506, or as you move into practice with groups, 509, any of those, they all have included different theories of practice. These are conceptualizations of how individuals are affected by different things and different strategies for providing solution. That is the same thing that we have with community theories. So while they may sound very foreign, They're not to those of us who have worked in community practice settings, and they inform our practice just like theories related to cognitive behavioral therapy or rational emotive therapy or Gestalt or any of those. Community practice is based on our social work's mission and purpose. We have always had this dual perspective of the person and the environment. I think this is one of the key things that makes us different than other helping professions. If you think about, someone asks you, well, how are you different than a counselor or a psychologist? Well, one of our key differences is that we equally consider this dual perspective of person and environment. It's not just helping the person. Community practice is based in our early history. For those of you who remember Social Work 101, one of our founding mothers was Mary Richmond, who was involved with charity organization societies. These started in London in the late 1800s, and basically they were friendly visitors who were providing case services to individuals in need. Mary Richmond wrote one of the first books related to social casework in 1920. And so the Charity Organization Society, while it dealt more with individuals, it also recognized the fact that individuals needed help sometimes accessing community services. The other part of our history is the settlement house. The settlement house movement was oftentimes attributed to Jane Addams and Hull House in Chicago, once again in the late 1800s. Involvement of social change in terms of oftentimes the settlement house workers actually lived in these communities, and if you see my little diagram or picture, there's actually a bridge between the community and another community. So settlement house movements involve social reform as well as helping assimilate immigrants that were new to the country, providing job training, educational components, and a wide array of services. All right. Other aspects of our community or history is that social work's involvement in social change or larger macro practice has kind of ebbed and flowed historically, so your book touches a little bit on that as well. All right, community practice is also referenced in NASW, which is our professional organization, the National Association of Social Workers. It says a historic and defining feature of social work is the profession's focus on individual well-being in a social context and the well-being of society. Fundamental to social work is attention to the environmental forces that create, contribute to, and address problems in living. So we know we keep hearing on the political scene the issues of unemployment. And we could talk about job creation and working with the private sector in order to do job creation. But we know that for those individuals that are impacted by unemployment, it has everything to do with the lack of job availability or in their particular professional area as well. CSWE, our Council on Social Work Education, that is our accrediting body. They require that all BSWs and MSW educational programs include knowledge and skills in social relations and social systems. This whole notion of practice with individuals, families, groups, organizations, and communities. All right, when we think about social work practice, we're in a changing social environment. It's constantly evolving. We never know, as I said, it reflects the political, the economic, and the social context of each time period. All right, there have been some calls for revitalization of community in recent years. There's a great book that I encourage you to purchase called Unfaithful Angels, and while it's getting a little bit dated now, it was written in 1994. What Gilbert and Specht did was Specht and Courtney. Gilbert and Specht wrote another book. So Specht and Courtney, what they did is they basically challenged social work and said that we have abandoned our mission for sake of psychotherapy. And they're very critical about the fact that in the 1990s, there was a heavy emphasis of social workers getting involved in private practice and the direct practice arena, more like psychotherapists, rather than aligning with our mission, which was bringing about social change. So, interesting book. Where are we going as a profession? Well, the Social Work Reinvestment Act has been put into place and is attempting to bring national and federal attention to social work and what we can do. Where are we going in terms of communities? Wow. There has definitely been a weakening of communities. We're a mobile society. Oftentimes people live in communities where they don't know their neighbors. They move from place to place. Extended families do not live close by to provide support. We don't oftentimes, we drive. So some of y'all may relate to this in that you live in one community, work in another community, and you may even be doing an internship in a different community. So it's hard to have a real strong tie or connection to communities. And that's had an impact on our community practice work. Here's a couple of links for you to check out regarding the Social Work Reinvestment Act and some of the NASW federal policy priorities. So I encourage you to look at both of those links to better inform yourself. Okay, this part of the chapter really deals with the fact of making a parallel between problem-solving process in work with individuals and with groups, organizations, communities. They're basically the same process or strategy. The first one is where we recognize the problem or we establish the need for change. So when a client comes to you, they have some kind of a problem. If they didn't have a problem, they wouldn't be seeking social work services. Same thing is true for a community or a larger a segment of a community or an organization, is there has been some recognition that we've got a problem or there's a need that exists. Your book elaborates on, as we talk about moving forward and developing objectives to then kind of get us in focus. They talk about using SMART objectives. There's a fun little acronym that SMART, S-M-A-R-R-T. These are objectives that they're specific, they're measurable, they're acceptable, they're realistic, they're results-oriented, and they're time-specific. So as we begin the problem-solving process with organizations and communities, it's important to think about our assessment and leading into our development of objectives using these particular characteristics. All right, second step in the problem-solving strategy is information gathering. Next, assessment and development of a plan. Fourth is our actual intervention. And then last is evaluation and termination. So those are the same things we go through with individual families, or if you're working with a group in some type of a setting, same thing, true of organizations and communities. So as you have some opportunities to work in these larger levels of systems, just keep that in mind. What you're doing is not any different in terms of the steps. It's just that you're typically working with a larger number of players. All right, your book, I think, gives some really excellent examples that kind of show this parallel. The first case example is that of a direct practice problem-solving process with Mrs. S. And then the second one is a problem-solving process with a rural community in California. Bottom line, the same process applies with both individuals and with communities. So please take time to read both of those and understand those. All right, when we think about ethics, advocacy, and community practice, oftentimes we see our profession as a calling. Some of y'all felt that. You just say, social work is what I know I'm supposed to be doing. But at the same time, it's important that the clients we serve, including organizations and communities, also have protection. So therefore, as a profession, we do have some sanctions with which we have some parameters for our practice. All right, now your book talks a lot about social work values and ethics and what the difference is. Basically, when we think about values, these are really kind of the emotional or the motivational standards behind our ethics. Ethics tend to be the rules that guide our behavior. Ethics say thou shalt or thou shalt not. And then the values are kind of what underlies that. So with social work, our code of ethics is very explicit. It defines both our principles and our values and our ethical standards. So the book talks about some of there are 6 core values of the social work profession. service, social justice, dignity and worth of the person, importance of relationships, integrity, and competence. And as you look at those values and then the resulting ethical principles, you can see that many of those align with larger systems. It's not just helping an individual. When we think about social justice and challenging injustice, that's affecting a group of individuals. We think about service, it's helping all others. So we have both our values and our ethics. So social justice is one of the core values of social work. So think about why you think social justice is so important to our profession. Why don't we just, if we're going to help people, do we really have to address injustice? Well, I think for most of us, or any of you who experienced injustice, the answer is yes. We know that people can't reach their full potential if they are oppressed or they are dealing with injustice. All right, there's a new term that's come in recent years called virtue ethics. And these are basically concerned about the social relationships that people have with one another and developing good character and judgment in professionals. So virtue ethics go beyond just looking at regulating ethical behavior, but talk about, are we virtuous? Do we have good integrity? Do we really have character in order to exercise professional judgment? Our social work code of ethics are basically considered our prescriptions of professional behavior. I certainly hope that everyone is familiar with the NASW Code of Ethics. If not, you need to look it up and read through it. I keep a copy on my desk at work because I'll get calls from former students or current students or colleagues of mine, or even just myself, in situations where I need to consult the Code of Ethics for guidance. It reflects our values and ethics, our practice wisdom, experience, and empirical research in order to help us make professional choices and decisions. All right, which of the 6 areas of ethical standards relate to community practice? So these are the overall categories of ethical standards. There are 6 of them. The first one is our responsibility to individuals. All right, so I want you to look at the Code of Ethics, or you can look in your book, and see which of the 6 areas specifically relates to community practice or the larger social welfare. What do the standards indicate we have a responsibility to do or not to do related to community practice? So oftentimes this is something that, for those of us new coming into the profession, we think about things like confidentiality and don't have sex with clients, and we know those are like the key ethical standards. But there are other things that we are called by our ethical standards that we have a responsibility to do in order to improve or enhance the larger social welfare of society. Okay, another word, and I really like this word, fiduciary. I want you to look up the word fiduciary if you don't already know what it means, and think about how it applies to social work, to community practice. Have you heard this word before? Bottom line is, we as social work professionals have a fiduciary responsibility to our clients at whatever level of systems that is. All right, when we think about defining our clients in community practice, this is where we sometimes run into some issues and dilemmas. It's sometimes hard to know whether or not, who's our client. That if you're dealing with your agency has guidelines. So as a social worker, our ethical responsibilities say that we have a responsibility to our employer. At the same time, if those policies or procedures are serving to hurt others, then should we look at taking a more broader community stance? What if there's a number, what if there's, back in the old days of discrimination based on race and ethnicity, banks were often accused of redlining, which means they were only providing bank loans for housing and businesses in certain areas. And if you lived in another area, predominantly a minority area, you could not get a bank loan. Now, this has since been outlawed, although it may still happen, I won't say informally, but perhaps less blatantly. But if you were aware of those kinds of practices, how would you feel about needing to, it's not just helping Mrs. Smith because she can't get a mortgage loan and she's, wants to buy a home and be able to establish a firm home for her children and family. But if this is going on all over, then perhaps we have the responsibility to address it from a larger issue. All right, in terms of our ethics, we are involved in advocacy. We have a responsibility to provide our clients with informed consent, and sometimes we're involved in whistleblowing, which means if there are practices going on that are not in the best interest of clients, even at the risk to our own professional well-being, we have a responsibility to our clients. So, I want you to think about an example in which your development and functioning has been influenced by the community. What are some of the ethical dilemmas that are faced in practice for client advocacy when employed by a social agency? As you're doing your field internship, or if you're working in social services, think about how oftentimes employees almost get apathetic about client advocacy because it's so hard. Also, think about how the concept of benefit to the greatest number of people, even when risking harm to a few, fits in social work. This is probably one of our greatest ethical dilemmas, is do we hurt a few in order to do the greater good for the greater number of people? And if so, what does that mean to those few that are hurt? Okay, that's chapter 1. You may be either turned on or turned off by now. This book is very dense. There's a lot of content, and so it's going to take some work on your part. My suggestion is that you read through it quickly, do a quick overview, then go back in after you look at the PowerPoints and try to glean out more information that relates to that. Hang in there. It's exciting stuff, especially when we get to the application part. So the first couple of chapters are more about providing some of the overview and background of it. So hope that you have a great week. I will have additional things posted in terms of some activities.